There exists a moment, suspended between the dying of daylight and the coronation of darkness, when the membrane separating the physical realm from the spiritual dimension becomes gossamer thin, translucent, permeable. It is during this sacred threshold that prayers uttered with authentic conviction penetrate beyond the atmosphere, beyond the celestial vault, reaching the very consciousness of the universe itself. This is a story about such a prayer, but more profoundly, it is a chronicle about what transpires when an individual's faith becomes so incandescent, so unshakable, so absolutely certain, that reality itself must restructure to accommodate it. But understand this before we journey deeper. This is not a comfortable parable designed to soothe your sensibilities. This is not a sanitized narrative where righteousness is immediately rewarded and wickedness swiftly punished. This is the raw, unvarnished truth about suffering, about mockery, about the excruciating weight of unfulfilled longing, and about how sometimes the universe answers prayers in ways that shatter every expectation. If you possess the fortitude to witness a woman stripped of dignity, mocked by those who should have been her sisters, pushed to the precipice of absolute despair, and if you can endure watching as she transforms that suffering into something so powerful that it reverberates through generations, then continue listening. This is the testimony of Grace, a name meaning divine favor. A woman whose reproductive organs remained obstinately sealed, but whose spiritual conviction would ultimately move the foundational pillars of existence itself. A woman who discovered that the universe does not respond to desperation, but to declaration. Not to begging, but to believing. Not to hopelessness, but to faith so absolute it borders on audacity. 7 excruciating years she endured. 7 complete cycles through seasons. 7 repetitions of watching her belly remain flat while other women's bodies swelled with the promise of continuation. 7 years of whispers, sideways glances, and cruelty disguised as concern. But on this particular evening, everything would irrevocably transform, because Grace had finally comprehended something that most mortals never grasp in entire lifetimes. That faith is not about believing despite the absence of evidence. It is about knowing with such unshakable certainty that the universe has no alternative but to manifest that knowing into material reality. What you are about to witness is not mythology. It is not fabrication designed for entertainment. In cities across the world, this story exists in variations. Sometimes the woman's name changes, sometimes the location shifts, but the fundamental truth remains constant and unassailable. There are prayers that dissipate into the atmosphere like morning mist. And then there are prayers that cleave through the very fabric of what we call reality. Prayers so powerful they create ripples in the cosmic order. Prayers that the universe cannot ignore because they carry the frequency of absolute knowing rather than desperate hoping. Grace was about to utter such a prayer. And nothing, not in her city, not in her life, not in the lives of those who tormented her, would ever be identical again. Are you prepared? Then let us descend into this chronicle, into the darkness before the dawn, into the suffering that precedes transformation, into the story of how one woman's unbreakable faith became a testament that would echo through generations. Grace awakened each morning before her alarm, before the city stirred into full wakefulness, before the performance of contentment she maintained throughout daylight hours became necessary. These pre-dawn moments belonged exclusively to her, the only interval when she permitted her carefully constructed mask to fracture, when authentic emotion could seep through the cracks she kept meticulously sealed during public presentation. She was 32 years old, considered by many to be approaching the threshold where fertility begins its statistical decline. She had been married to Michael for 7 years. 7 years that should have produced at minimum 2 children, perhaps 3 if fortune smiled with particular benevolence. But Grace's womb remained as barren as concrete. Month after month, year after year, the crimson confirmation of her continued childlessness arrived with cruel punctuality. Each monthly bleeding felt like a small death, a mourning ritual for children who existed only in the realm of possibility, never crossing the threshold into actualization. Michael was not a harsh husband by modern standards. He possessed sufficient wealth to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. He was a successful investment banker. Their penthouse apartment overlooked the city's financial district, and their social circle included the city's elite. His first wife, Victoria, from his previous marriage, had given him 2 sons who now attended prestigious boarding schools. His second wife, Isabella, from another brief marriage, had contributed a daughter before their divorce. The architecture of their unconventional living arrangement created its own hierarchy of visibility. Victoria's section constantly reverberated with the energy of visiting sons, their gaming equipment, sports trophies, academic achievements displayed prominently. Isabella's area maintained a different atmosphere. Her daughter's dance recital photos, art projects, evidence of a child being raised between 2 households. But Grace's section remained perpetually silent, unnaturally quiet. The absence of children's presence created a void that seemed to amplify with each passing season, becoming more conspicuous, more accusatory, more damning. The shopping district constituted their social circle's primary theater of hierarchy and judgment. It was here that reputations were constructed and demolished, where social connections were forged through carefully orchestrated coffee dates, where the intricate web of upper-class politics was woven through seemingly casual encounters. It was also where Grace experienced her most acute isolation. The district teemed with fertility, pregnant women in designer maternity wear, nannies pushing $1,000 strollers, mothers coordinating playdates over lattes. There existed an unspoken understanding among the women in their social circle, an invisible demarcation that separated those who had fulfilled the expected life trajectory from those who had not. Motherhood was not merely a personal choice in this community. It represented a woman's complete validation, her justification for occupying space in the social hierarchy, her contribution to the continuation of prestigious family lineages. Without children, a woman existed in a peculiar liminal state, technically married but somehow incomplete, physically present but socially peripheral, alive but somehow not fully living in their world. The women did not consciously conspire to exclude Grace. Their avoidance was more insidious than deliberate cruelty. It was the reflexive pulling away that humans perform when confronted with misfortune they fear might be contagious, like avoiding someone whose career has publicly failed lest the stain spread. Michael maintained scrupulous fairness in the distribution of his attention and resources among his 3 wives. He rotated nights between their separate bedroom suites with mathematical equality, ensured each received identical monthly allowances, and never displayed obvious favoritism in public settings. But fairness and warmth are not synonymous. When Michael visited Victoria's suite, his conversations were animated with discussions of his sons' academic achievements, plans for their future business careers. With Isabella, he discussed their daughter's artistic talents, the careful balance of co-parenting with an ex-spouse. With Grace, his visits carried a different quality, polite, respectful, but fundamentally hollow. They would exchange pleasantries about the day's activities, comment on news headlines, discuss mundane household matters. But beneath these surface interactions lay an enormous unacknowledged void, the glaring absence that neither dared name directly. The nights were most difficult. During daylight hours, Grace could armor herself with industry, with the performance of perfect domesticity, with the maintenance of dignity through impeccable execution of every expected duty. But darkness stripped away these protective layers, leaving her vulnerable to the full weight of her circumstance. She would lie awake, listening to the sounds emanating from other sections of the penthouse. A teenager laughing during a video game, Victoria's voice soothing one of her sons through a college application stress, Isabella gently negotiating bedtime with her daughter. These ordinary sounds of parenthood created a symphony of exclusion, each note emphasizing Grace's absence from that fundamental experience. In her darkest moments, Grace would interrogate the universe with questions that had no satisfactory answers. Had she committed some transgression in a previous existence, some karmic offense that demanded this particular punishment? Had the universe withdrawn its blessing for reasons incomprehensible to mortal understanding? Was her body fundamentally defective, broken in ways no fertility specialist's treatments could remedy? Or, and this possibility generated the most profound despair, was she simply unlucky, caught in the random cruelty of existence, where some women conceived effortlessly, while others remained perpetually barren for no reason whatsoever, no lesson to learn, no cosmic justice at work, just the meaningless capriciousness of fate? Each morning, Grace performed the ritual of reconstruction, transforming herself from the woman who wept in darkness to the woman who moved through daylight with dignity intact. She understood intuitively that vulnerability in her position would be interpreted as weakness, that any visible crack in her composure would invite even more invasive scrutiny and judgment. So she perfected the art of the mask. She smiled when appropriate. She volunteered for charity events. She maintained her figure with obsessive dedication, dressed impeccably, kept their section of the penthouse with such impeccable standards that even the most critical mother-in-law could find no fault. But beneath this flawless exterior, behind the carefully maintained facade, a pressure was building. Like water behind a dam, like magma beneath the earth's crust, something fundamental was accumulating force, approaching the threshold where containment would no longer be possible. The question was not whether Grace would break. The question was what form her breaking would take, whether it would be the shattering of despair or the eruption of transformation. The answer was approaching, carried on the urban wind of destiny, moving closer with each passing day. The annual Children's Hope Gala represented the most significant event in their social circle's calendar. A fundraising extravaganza benefiting pediatric hospitals, celebrating successful families who gave generously, and reaffirming the community's collective status through displays of wealth and philanthropy. For most attendees, the gala constituted pure joy, an opportunity to wear haute couture, to be photographed for society pages, to network with the city's elite, to demonstrate their success through charitable giving. But for Grace, the approaching gala generated mounting dread, because this particular event included a specific ceremony that would thrust her childlessness into the center of attention with unavoidable brutality. The preparation for public appearance, when one occupies a stigmatized position, requires strategic calculation that fortunate individuals never contemplate. Every choice of gown carries potential interpretation. Every jewelry selection sends unintended messages. Every decision about presentation becomes fraught with implications. Grace finally selected a gown of deep midnight blue, beautiful but not ostentatious, elegant but not attention-seeking. She chose minimal jewelry, diamond studs, her wedding ring. She arranged her hair in a classic updo, without elaborate styling. The goal was to be present but peripheral, visible but unremarkable, to occupy space without drawing scrutiny. As darkness descended outside and the gala reached its full intensity, the ballroom transformed into a theater of wealth and status. The music established an atmosphere that synchronized the crowd into a collective display of success. Champagne flowed freely, loosening inhibitions and dissolving whatever minimal restraint normally governed competitive social dynamics. The auction portion of the evening generated excitement, wealthy attendees bidding against each other, not just for the items, but for the status of being seen as most generous, most successful, most able to contribute to the cause. When the music shifted and the ceremony began, a hush descended over the previously animated celebration. This was the moment many had been anticipating. The Mother of the Year Awards, a tradition honoring women who had achieved the dual success of professional accomplishment and exceptional parenting, asking the community to celebrate these exemplars and contribute generously to help less fortunate children. The event organizer's voice, amplified through the sound system, carried authority. Will all nominees for Mother of the Year please join me on stage to receive recognition and community appreciation? One by one, the mothers came forward. Each received their crystal trophy. Each heard her accomplishments praised. Each was celebrated by the entire community's enthusiastic applause, the sound of collective validation, of belonging, of having achieved the pinnacle of their social world's definition of success. Grace stood at the periphery of the crowd, trying to make herself small, trying to become invisible. But invisibility is impossible when one is the only woman in the social circle of childbearing age who cannot participate in the community's central ritual of celebrating motherhood and success. The ceremony seemed interminable to Grace. Each name called, each woman celebrated, each round of applause. The ritual that should have taken perhaps 20 minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Each moment a fresh wound. Each celebration a reminder of her fundamental failure to achieve what was expected in their world. She felt tears beginning to form and fought them back with desperate intensity. To weep publicly would be to admit defeat, to confirm what everyone whispered, that she was broken, inadequate, unworthy of her place in Michael's life and their social circle. Champagne possesses the curious quality of simultaneously loosening tongues and dissolving whatever minimal restraint normally governs human cruelty. As the night progressed and glasses emptied and were refilled, the already tenuous boundaries of social courtesy began to disintegrate entirely. Victoria, emboldened by alcohol and surrounded by an audience eager for entertainment, decided that Grace's presence provided an irresistible opportunity for the particular form of social bonding that occurs when a group unites against a common target. Her voice carried with deliberate projection, ensuring her words reached far beyond her immediate circle. Tell me, ladies, have you ever witnessed anything as pathetic as attending the Mother of the Year gala when you've never even had a pregnancy scare? It's like showing up to a marathon when you can't even jog around the block. The laughter that greeted Victoria's comment was not the warm, inclusive laughter of shared joy. It was the harsh, excluding laughter that humans employ when establishing hierarchy, when defining who belongs within the protected circle and who must remain outside it. It was laughter as weapon, as social enforcement mechanism, as collective punishment. Isabella, sensing an opportunity to solidify her own precarious position by aligning with Victoria's dominance, added her contribution. Perhaps we should start a new category. Most creative excuses for why IVF didn't work this time. Grace could give an acceptance speech about how her body just doesn't cooperate with modern medicine. More laughter. Louder now. Feeding on itself, growing more emboldened with each iteration. But the cruelest blow came from Jennifer. Young, newly married, recently delivered of twin girls, and therefore particularly invested in establishing her newfound status as someone who had it all, had achieved what Grace could not. Jennifer's youth made her mockery somehow more vicious, unmarred by the wisdom that sometimes comes with age, untempered by the compassion that life's sufferings occasionally cultivate. My therapist told me something interesting, Jennifer announced, her voice carrying the particular self-righteousness of the recently validated. She said that sometimes the universe withholds fertility from certain women as a message. These women exist as living reminders that not everyone is meant to have everything. Some people are just supposed to watch from the sidelines, while others actually live life fully. The word struck Grace with physical force, as if Jennifer had driven a knife directly into her chest. Not meant for everything. Living reminder of inadequacy. Watching from sidelines. The accusation that her childlessness represented cosmic judgment, universal rejection, existential condemnation. This was the nightmare that haunted her therapy sessions, and now it had been spoken aloud, given public voice, validated by social circle laughter. For several heartbeats, Grace could not move, could not breathe. The ballroom seemed to tilt, the chandelier lights becoming too bright, the jazz too loud, the presence of all these people too overwhelming. Every eye seemed fixed upon her. Every face seemed twisted with mockery. Every whispered conversation seemed certainly about her inadequacy. Without conscious decision, Grace found herself moving, walking, not toward Michael, who was networking with business associates across the room, not toward any destination she could name, simply away, away from the laughter, away from the chandeliers, away from the communal celebration that had no space for her particular anguish. Her feet carried her toward the exit, through the hotel lobby, toward the boundary where the ordered world of wealth and status transitioned into the unpredictable realm of the city night. When Grace reached the park lake, the same lake she passed daily on morning runs, but had never truly seen, the last threads of her carefully maintained composure finally shredded completely. She collapsed at the water's edge, her body convulsing with sobs that 7 years of suppression had made violent, desperate, consuming. She wept for the children who existed only as ghostly possibilities in her imagination. She wept for the woman she had been 7 years ago, young and hopeful and certain that motherhood would follow naturally. She wept for the gradual erosion of her dignity, the progressive diminishment of her place in the social hierarchy, the slow transformation from person into cautionary tale. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. something that had been compressed and compressed under the weight of mounting humiliation until it had transformed from mere emotion into something denser, something more potent, something approaching the threshold of transformation. How long Grace remained collapsed at the lake's edge, she could not have said. Minutes or hours lost meaning. But gradually, she became aware of changes in her surroundings. The moon, which should have been only a crescent based on the calendar, had risen huge and full, impossibly luminous, bathing the city in silver radiance. The lake, which should have been merely dark urban water, seemed to have absorbed the moonlight and transformed it into something living, pulsing with gentle bioluminescence. The very air grew thick, charged with presence, as if the membrane separating physical reality from spiritual dimension had grown gossamer thin. Grace slowly pushed herself upright. Her tears had ceased flowing, replaced by something else. A clarity, a certainty, a knowing that descended from someplace beyond rational thought. She understood, with sudden crystalline comprehension, that she had arrived at a threshold, that this moment, this night of ultimate humiliation, this collapse at the lake's edge, this surrender to absolute despair, was not an ending but a transition, that everything that had brought her to this point was not random suffering but preparation. When Grace spoke, her voice emerged strong and clear, carrying across the water with inexplicable resonance, as if the universe itself was amplifying her words to ensure they reached every relevant dimension of existence. "I am done begging," she announced to the moon, to the lake, to the spirits, to the cosmic intelligence that governed the mysterious mechanisms of fate and fortune. "I am finished with pleading, with trying to earn what should be mine, with approaching life as if I'm unworthy of what others receive so easily. Tonight, everything changes. Tonight I do not ask. I declare." And with those words, Grace crossed an invisible threshold from which there would be no returning to her previous understanding of herself, her worth, or her relationship with the universe that had seemed to abandon her. The real story was only now beginning. The city park lake possessed a reputation throughout the metropolitan area as a location where something indefinable shifted, where morning joggers reported moments of unexpected clarity, where sunset brought inexplicable peace, where the boundary between the concrete reality of urban life and something more mysterious grew strangely thin. But Grace had transcended fear. When suffering reaches sufficient magnitude, when humiliation achieves certain depth, when one has already experienced the worst that social death can inflict, the things that once generated terror lose their power entirely. What did she have remaining to lose? Her dignity, already stripped away by public mockery. Her reputation, already destroyed by the label of barrenness. Her place in the social hierarchy, already demolished. Grace understood intuitively that what she was about to do required ritual, the creation of sacred space. Even here in the midst of the city, she removed her heels, the designer shoes chosen so carefully to navigate the impossible expectations of her social position, and walked barefoot into the lake's shallows. She stepped into the water, feeling the cool embrace around her feet and ankles, the gentle current tugging as if testing her determination. She cupped water in her hands and poured it over her head once, twice, 3 times, a baptism of her own design. A washing away of shame and accumulated sorrow, a purification before approaching the divine. When Grace finally spoke, her voice emerged from depths she had not known existed within her. Not the voice of the compliant wife, who endured mockery with downcast eyes. Not the voice of the supplicant who had previously approached life with apologies and begging. This was the voice of someone who had passed through the fire of ultimate suffering and been transformed by it, emerging with her essence purified, made clear about who she was and what she required. "Universe," she called out, addressing the divine intelligence from which all existence emanates. God, Spirit, whatever force governs the mysterious mechanisms of creation and destiny. Her voice rang out across the water, and impossibly, the city seemed to grow quieter. Cars on distant streets falling silent, the hum of the metropolis fading, as if every conscious presence within the urban landscape had paused to listen. "I do not come before you broken and begging, though they have attempted to break me. I do not approach you in shame, though they have attempted to shame me. I do not ask for your mercy as if I am undeserving, though they have named me inadequate. Grace's voice grew stronger with each declaration, powered by 7 years of suppressed emotion, finally given permission for full expression. I come before you in faith, faith deeper than the ocean's most profound trenches, faith more solid than the mountains, faith more enduring than the sun that rises each morning without fail. The universe, it seemed, was listening. The lake, which should have been merely urban water, following the immutable laws of physics, began behaving with impossible intentionality. Ripples spread from Grace's position in mathematically perfect circles, as if her presence had become a stone dropped into the cosmic pond, creating waves that would eventually reach infinite shores. The mist rising from the water's surface gathered itself into swirling vortices of vapor, not dispersing randomly as mist should, but organizing itself into spiral patterns, the shape of galaxies, of consciousness itself, of the fundamental structure underlying existence. They call me barren, but I declare that I am merely a vessel awaiting the proper moment for filling. They call me inadequate, but I declare that I am blessed with patience that transcends their limited comprehension. They call me a failure, but I declare that my worth is measured not by what grows in my womb during any particular season, but by what remains unbroken in my spirit despite their attempts to shatter it. Grace placed her hand on her flat belly, and in that gesture was both acknowledgement and defiance. Yes, I am currently childless, but this is temporary state, not permanent identity. Universe, I make you a solemn promise. When you answer my prayer, and I say when not if, because I speak from knowing rather than hoping, I will not become what wounded me. I will not mock those who mocked me. I will not rejoice in their discomfort or diminishment. Instead, I will demonstrate that authentic strength manifests not through cruelty but through compassion. I will teach my child, the child I already claim in the realm of spirit, waiting only to manifest in the realm of flesh, that every blessing carries responsibility, that those who suffer most profoundly develop the capacity for the greatest love, that the measure of a soul is not what it receives, but what it does with what it has been given. She threw her arms wide, a gesture that somehow contained both surrender and conquest, both humility and audacity. I declare my womb open. I declare my destiny fulfilled. I declare my child already conceived in the dimension of possibility, requiring only time for the journey from spiritual reality into physical manifestation. And I offer profound gratitude in advance for the blessing I know with unshakable certainty is already mine. And then the universe answered, not with words, not with voices descending from clouds. The universe speaks its own language, the language of synchronicity, of impossible coincidence, of natural laws suddenly bending to accommodate intentions, spoken with sufficient conviction and absolute faith. The lake surged. A column of water rose upward, defying gravity, reaching toward the moon as if attempting to complete a circuit between earthly and celestial realms. The water caught moonlight and became incandescent, radiating luminosity that had no scientific explanation, that existed somewhere between material substance and pure energy. When the water returned to its normal flow, when the luminescence faded, when the impossible physics of what had just occurred gave way to ordinary natural phenomena, Grace stood transformed. The same woman physically, but fundamentally altered in some essential way that would have been visible to anyone with eyes to see beyond mere surface appearance. She no longer carried the energy of longing, of desperate hoping against accumulating evidence. She carried instead the unshakable certainty of someone who has received direct communication from the universe itself, who knows with conviction that transcends logic that what she has claimed in the realm of spiritual reality will manifest in the realm of physical experience. It was done. The declaration had been made, heard, and accepted. Everything that would follow was merely the universe's process of translating spiritual certainty into material manifestation, a process that operates according to its own mysterious timeline, but which, once set in motion, cannot be prevented or reversed. As dawn approached, painting the sky between skyscrapers with tentative brushstrokes of purple and rose gold, Grace made her way back toward the city. She moved with unhurried grace, savoring the cool morning air on her skin, feeling her bare feet connect with the earth even in the midst of urban concrete. She felt no urgency to announce what had occurred at the lake. She understood intuitively that this kind of knowing does not need validation or explanation. The people who mocked her would have their own reckoning with reality soon enough. The universe would provide all the proof necessary, in its own perfect timing. For now, it was sufficient to know, to carry within her heart the absolute certainty that everything had changed, even if nothing yet appeared different to external observation. The seed had been planted in spiritual soil. The gestation had begun, not in her womb yet, but in the dimension of possibility that would eventually crystallize into manifestation. She smiled, a genuine smile, perhaps the first authentic smile she had permitted herself in 7 years, because she understood now that the answer had never been in doubt. The universe had simply been waiting for her to stop begging and start believing, to stop hoping and start declaring. And now that the declaration had been made, now that the frequency of absolute faith had been broadcast into the cosmic realm, reality itself would have no choice but to reorganize itself to reflect that certainty. The mockery she had endured would become the foundation for her testimony. The suffering would become her credential for teaching others. The 7 years of emptiness would give way to fulfillment, so profound it would be remembered for generations. But all of that was future manifestation. For now, as dawn broke over the city and a new day began, Grace simply walked home with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has completed the most important work of their existence. The rest was just waiting for the universe to catch up with what she already knew. The universe does not operate on human timescales or expectations. The cosmos moves according to its own mysterious rhythms, translating spiritual reality into physical manifestation through processes that appear to mortal perception as either agonizingly slow or miraculously instantaneous, depending on alignment between human desire and divine timing. 3 days had passed since Grace's declaration at the lake. To external observation, nothing had changed. Her womb remained empty. Her social position remained marginal. The mockery, though temporarily muted by the scandal of her dramatic gala exit, continued in whispered text messages and private conversations. Yet everything had changed. Those with spiritual sensitivity could feel it. A shift in the air surrounding Grace, an alteration in her energetic frequency that created subtle disturbance in the social ecosystem she inhabited. Victoria was the first to consciously register the change, though she could not have explained precisely what felt different. She had encountered Grace at their favorite organic market, expecting the usual averted eyes and hurried murmured greeting that characterized their typical interactions. Instead, Grace had looked directly at her, not with hostility or resentment, but with something more unsettling, a serene knowing, a confidence that had no basis in any changed external circumstances, a smile that suggested Grace possessed information that Victoria did not, that the game they had been playing had rules that had suddenly been altered without Victoria receiving notification. "There's something wrong with her," Victoria muttered to Isabella later over lattes, unable to shake the discomfort that brief encounter had generated. "She's smiling. Why is she smiling? What does she have to smile about?" Even Michael, who typically maintained careful emotional distance from the complex dynamics between his wives, found himself noticing Grace with renewed attention. During his scheduled visit to her suite that night, he discovered himself actually conversing with her rather than merely exchanging obligatory pleasantries before their mechanical intimacy. She seemed larger somehow, not physically, but in presence, as if she had been existing at partial capacity for years and had suddenly expanded into her full dimensions. She spoke with animation about ordinary matters, a documentary she'd watched, observations about city development, thoughts about interior design, but underneath the mundane content, he sensed depths he had not previously recognized. When he mentioned this observation to his business partner days later over golf, the man laughed. Perhaps she's finally accepted her situation and found peace. Or perhaps she's having an affair, and that's what generates her newfound confidence. But Michael shook his head. It was neither of those explanations. It was something else entirely, something he could not name, but which filled him with a strange mixture of curiosity and trepidation. The city's most respected spiritual advisor, a woman named Eleanor who had guided countless clients through life's difficulties, had never witnessed anything quite like the visions that began 3 nights ago. She had seen hundreds of readings, interpreted thousands of dreams, but the vision that visited her was unprecedented. In the vision, she had seen a woman standing in urban waters under moonlight, and from her belly had grown a tree. Not an ordinary tree, but a tree of pure light that expanded until its branches sheltered the entire city beneath its canopy. When she woke, her silk sheets were drenched with sweat despite the air conditioning. She understood immediately that this was not mere dream but vision, prophetic communication requiring immediate attention and interpretation. When Eleanor appeared at the penthouse at dawn, an unprecedented occurrence, as the psychic typically waited for clients to book appointments at her consultation center. The entire household understood that something extraordinary was occurring. Michael emerged from his bedroom in a silk robe, his face showing both concern and curiosity. Behind him, his 3 wives gathered in the main living area, each wondering if the psychic's unexpected visit concerned their family specifically. "Eleanor," Michael greeted the woman with appropriate respect. "Your presence honors us. Though I confess surprise, has something arisen that requires immediate attention?" Eleanor settled herself with the practiced grace of someone who has performed this ritual thousands of times, arranged her divination materials with precision, and then looked directly at Michael with eyes that seemed to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. 3 nights passed. A declaration was spoken at the lake in the park. A declaration of such power, such absolute conviction, such unshakable faith, that it caused disturbance in the spiritual realm significant enough to reach my consciousness through vision. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "That declaration concerned your household specifically, Michael. It was spoken by one of your wives, the one whom your social circle calls barren, though that designation is about to be revealed as profoundly mistaken." Michael felt his heart accelerate with sudden comprehension even before Eleanor spoke the name. "Grace? But that's impossible. 7 years have passed. Every fertility specialist, every treatment we've tried has confirmed." Eleanor raised her hand, interrupting with gentle authority. "The universe does not recognize medical limitations or statistics. It recognizes only faith, intention, and the proper alignment of spiritual forces. Someone in your household has achieved such alignment. The cards have spoken with unmistakable clarity." She gestured to the tarot spread before them, the pattern creating symbolic language that spiritual advisors spent lifetimes learning to interpret. "This configuration," Eleanor explained, her finger tracing the pattern, "appears perhaps twice in a reader's entire lifetime. It signifies what we call divine intervention, when personal faith becomes so strong that it literally moves the universe itself, manifesting against all probability as demonstration that the spiritual realm occasionally intervenes directly in human affairs when conviction achieves sufficient magnitude." She looked up from the cards, her penetrating eyes meeting Michael's skeptical ones with profound seriousness. "Your 3rd wife carries within her womb a child of destiny, Michael. Or rather, she will very shortly. The conception has already occurred in the spiritual dimension. The physical manifestation is merely matter of time, days or weeks at most. This child will be significant. This child's birth will be testimony that will echo through your family for generations." When Michael stepped to the window and his eyes found Grace across the living space, he saw her as if for the first time. No longer the peripheral wife, whose presence he had learned to overlook. No longer the source of vague embarrassment about infertility, but as a woman who had somehow, through means he did not comprehend, moved cosmic forces through the power of her faith alone. And when Grace looked up and met his gaze, smiling with serene confidence, Michael felt something shift in his chest. Not love exactly. Their relationship had never been built on romantic foundation, but profound respect, awe even, recognition that he had been living alongside someone of remarkable spiritual strength without ever truly seeing her. Within hours, Eleanor's prophecy had rippled through the social circle's communication networks with the speed that only truly shocking information achieves in the digital age. The psychic's pronouncements carried enormous weight, She was not known for dramatic exaggeration or false prophecies. Eleanor had predicted 3 major corporate mergers, 2 political scandals, and countless personal transformations. If Eleanor said the barren woman would conceive, then her statement demanded serious consideration. But belief did not come easily. 7 years of infertility could not be erased by a single prophecy, no matter how respected its source. The social circle divided into camps: those who believed Eleanor had been given genuine vision, and those who thought the aging psychic's abilities were finally failing her, that she had confused wishful thinking with reality. Victoria fell firmly into the skeptical camp. "Impossible," she declared in a group text to her closest allies. "I've shared a home with that woman for 7 years. If the universe intended to bless her, it would have done so long ago. This is either Eleanor's error or Grace's desperate manipulation. Perhaps she paid Eleanor to speak this nonsense, hoping belief might somehow make it real." Precisely 14 days after Eleanor's prophecy, Grace woke with a sensation that sent electric recognition through her entire nervous system. It was not pain. It was not illness. It was a presence, subtle, barely perceptible, but absolutely undeniable to someone who had spent 7 years becoming intimately acquainted with her body's rhythms and cycles. Something had changed. In the deepest cellular level of her being, in the hidden architecture of her womb that had remained obstinately closed for 7 years, something had finally unlocked, opened, welcomed. She lay very still, barely breathing, her hand pressed against her flat belly, listening with senses that transcended physical hearing for the whisper of new life taking root where there had been only absence. The tears that came were not the bitter tears of her years of suffering. These were tears of gratitude, of vindication, of profound relief, of absolute confirmation that she had been correct to trust her knowing, correct to speak her declaration with such certainty, correct to refuse the label of permanent barrenness that her world had attempted to permanently affix to her identity. "Thank you," she whispered to the universe, to God, to the divine intelligence that had finally aligned physical reality with spiritual certainty. "Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for answering. And thank you for trusting me with this blessing." She did not rush to announce her suspicion. She understood that this kind of knowing required time, required the body's confirmation through more obvious signs before public declaration would be appropriate or believed. But she knew, with the same absolute certainty that had powered her declaration at the lake, she knew that conception had occurred, that the child she had claimed in the spiritual realm was now beginning its journey toward physical manifestation. The physical transformation occurred gradually, then suddenly. For weeks, the changes were subtle enough that only Grace herself recognized them. A slight sensitivity in her breasts, a faint nausea in early mornings, a peculiar metallic taste that appeared without warning. The ordinary symptoms of early pregnancy that women throughout history have learned to recognize as harbingers of life taking root. But by the 6th week, the changes had become visible enough that experienced eyes could detect them. The way Grace carried herself had shifted. The quality of her skin had altered, taking on the particular luminosity that pregnancy often bestows. Her body was beginning to change in ways that no amount of denial could conceal. Victoria was the first among the wives to consciously register the physical evidence, and the recognition struck her like a physical blow. She had been in the process of criticizing Grace to Isabella, habitual behavior that had become comfortable ritual, when her eyes fell upon Grace's profile as the younger woman moved through sun salutations visible through the glass walls. The curve of Grace's belly was still minimal, barely perceptible to casual observation. But Victoria had borne 2 children. She knew the body's topography of pregnancy with intimate familiarity, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat, made her heart accelerate with sudden terrible understanding. "No," she whispered, the word emerging involuntarily. "No, that's impossible." But Isabella's examination confirmed what Victoria had seen. The subtle rounding, the way Grace's designer athleisure were now draped differently across her midsection, the characteristic fullness in her face and throat, the unmistakable signs that their barren co-wife was barren no longer. "Eleanor was right," Isabella breathed, her voice barely audible. The psychic was actually right. But how? 7 years she couldn't conceive, and suddenly, the implications crashed over both women simultaneously. If Grace conceived, if she bore a child after 7 years of infertility, if the prophecy manifested exactly as Eleanor had declared, then everything they had believed about cosmic justice, about divine favor, about their own superiority would be revealed as fundamentally mistaken. When Michael visited Grace that evening, he came not out of obligation or scheduled rotation, but out of genuine desire to be in her presence, to understand how this impossible thing had manifested. He found her radiant, peaceful, utterly without the anxiety he might have expected given the magnitude of what was occurring. "Tell me," he said simply. "Tell me what happened at the lake that night. Eleanor speaks of your declaration, but no one knows what you actually said." Grace smiled, that mysterious smile that had become her trademark in recent weeks. "I stopped begging and started declaring. I stopped hoping and started knowing. I spoke to the universe not as a desperate supplicant, but as someone stating what already existed in the realm of spiritual reality, waiting only for time to translate it into physical manifestation." As Grace described that night, the humiliation that had driven her to the lake, the transformation that occurred in her understanding, the declaration she had spoken with such conviction that reality itself had no choice but to respond, Michael found himself experiencing a kind of spiritual education his business school and corporate world had never provided. "So faith is not about believing despite doubt?" he asked, struggling to comprehend this worldview so foreign to his analytical mind. "No," Grace replied gently. "Faith is about knowing with such certainty that doubt cannot even form. It's about speaking from the ending rather than from the beginning. It's about claiming what is already yours in the spiritual realm and trusting that the physical realm will eventually align with that truth." By the 3rd month, Grace's pregnancy had become the social circle's primary topic of conversation. The impossible had manifested. The barren woman was barren no longer. Eleanor's prophecy had been vindicated with such precision that even the most skeptical were forced to acknowledge something extraordinary had occurred. But the transformation extended beyond Grace's physical condition. Something had shifted in the collective consciousness of their social world. The easy cruelty that had previously characterized interactions with those deemed unfortunate or inadequate had become uncomfortable, fraught with new awareness that human judgment might be profoundly wrong, that divine timing operates according to rhythms mortals cannot perceive. The first public reckoning came from Victoria. For weeks she had avoided Grace, unable to reconcile her 7 years of mockery with the undeniable evidence now visible beneath Grace's elegant maternity clothes. But the weight of her guilt had grown unbearable, pressing on her chest, disrupting her sleep, contaminating every moment with the terrible knowledge of how profoundly wrong she had been. She found Grace in the living area one afternoon, the weekly book club gathering providing unexpected witness to this moment. Victoria approached slowly, and when she tried to speak, her voice cracked and failed. Instead, she simply collapsed onto the sofa beside Grace, tears beginning to flow. "Grace," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "What have I done? The things I said, the way I treated you, how I led others to mock and exclude you. I have no defense. I have no excuse. I was cruel because your suffering made me uncomfortable, because mocking you made me feel superior, because I confused my blessing with my worth and your struggle with your deficiency." Grace set aside her book and turned to face Victoria fully, taking the older woman's hands in her own. "Sister," Grace said softly, her voice carrying no trace of vindictiveness or triumph, "I do not need your shame. I need your understanding. The universe did not answer my prayer to punish you or to prove you wrong. It answered to teach all of us, including me, that blessing and suffering are teachers, not judgments. That human cruelty often comes from discomfort with circumstances we don't understand. That compassion requires us to hold space for others' pain rather than using it to establish our own superiority." She placed Victoria's hand on her swollen belly, where the baby kicked with sudden vigor, as if emphasizing the point. The transformation in Victoria catalyzed changes throughout their social circle, and eventually the broader community. Isabella, witnessing Victoria's genuine repentance and Grace's gracious response, found her own capacity for cruelty exposed and uncomfortable. She too sought Grace's forgiveness, offering practical support through pregnancy's challenges. Even Jennifer, whose youth had made her mockery particularly vicious, came to Grace with tears and genuine remorse. "I didn't understand," the young woman confessed, curled on Grace's sofa while her twins napped in their expensive stroller. "I thought having children immediately made me complete, made me superior. I used your pain to elevate myself, because I was terrified of becoming what you were. But you were never what I thought. You were stronger than all of us, holding faith when we would have surrendered." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, something unexpected emerged. Women began seeking her counsel, not just about fertility, but about faith in general. How to maintain dignity in the face of failure. How to hold certainty when circumstances contradict hope. How to transform pain into wisdom rather than bitterness. Grace discovered that her 7 years of suffering had not been wasted. They had been preparation. They had taught her empathy that easy success never cultivates. They had developed strength that comfort never forges. They had given her authority to speak about transformation because she had lived it, had walked through the fire, and emerged not destroyed but refined. "The universe's timing is not punishment," she would tell those who came seeking understanding, her voice filling the peaceful workshop space. "It is education. Every delay develops patience. Every disappointment deepens faith. Every humiliation creates opportunity to choose between bitterness and growth. The question is not why do we suffer, but what will we do with the suffering we are given?" Grace's labor began as the moon reached fullness, perfect timing that even skeptics felt held meaning. The labor was long, as first births typically are, but Grace did not approach it with fear or resistance. She had spent 9 months preparing not just physically through prenatal yoga and nutrition, but spiritually through meditation and continued connection with the faith that had brought this child into being. She understood that birth is fundamentally a surrender, a letting go, a trust fall into the body's ancient wisdom, an acceptance that pain serves purpose when it brings forth life. The head midwife, a woman named Sarah who had brought countless souls across the threshold from spiritual to physical realm, had never witnessed anything quite like Grace's labor. Most first-time mothers tensed against the pain, fighting the process. But Grace breathed with it. The same breathing techniques she had practiced in yoga. The same surrender she had cultivated at the lake that transformative night. "She understands something most women never learn," Sarah whispered to her assistant. "She's not fighting the pain. She's breathing with it, moving with it, letting it do its work. She knows that the pain of birth is simply the price of bringing blessing into physical form." And then, as the moon reached its zenith directly overhead, casting silver light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Grace's child emerged into the world. The baby did not cry immediately. For several heartbeats that seemed to stretch into eternity, the infant simply existed in the threshold space between worlds, eyes opening to perceive this new realm with expression of impossible awareness. Then the cry came, not the distressed wail of trauma, but a sound like music, like joy made audible, like the universe itself celebrating successful manifestation. "A daughter," Sarah announced, placing the child on Grace's chest. "A daughter born under the full moon, at the precise moment of its zenith. She carries extraordinary destiny." As Grace held her daughter for the first time, feeling the tiny body against her chest, the small heart beating against her own, she experienced something beyond happiness, beyond relief, beyond vindication. She experienced completion, not because the child made her complete. She had learned through her journey that her worth was never dependent on motherhood, but because this represented the visible confirmation of everything she had declared at the lake 9 months prior. Faith spoken with absolute conviction does move the universe. Declarations made from certainty rather than desperation do manifest into physical reality. The cosmos does respond to those who refuse to surrender hope even when all evidence suggests hopelessness. "Welcome, my daughter," Grace whispered, her lips against the baby's still damp hair. "Welcome to the world that tried to convince me you would never exist. You are proof that patience, faith, and unbreakable conviction can create miracles that human limitation insists are impossible. When Sarah emerged to announce the successful birth, the entire household erupted in celebration. This was not merely joy at a new life. Births occurred regularly enough in their social circle. This was celebration of prophecy fulfilled, of faith vindicated, of the impossible made manifest before the entire community's witnessing. Michael stood at the center of the celebrating group, tears streaming down his face, something his business associates would never believe. His third wife, the one he had married almost as an afterthought to complete his unconventional household, the one whose infertility had been source of vague discomfort, had just delivered validation of a prophecy that had shaken their entire world's understanding of how reality operates. The naming celebration 7 days later drew the largest gathering the penthouse had ever hosted. Every member of their social circle attended. People came from rival social groups, having heard the story of the barren woman whose faith moved the universe. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. What name would be given to this child of prophecy, this manifestation of faith? Eleanor stood before Grace and her daughter, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light, streaming through windows. She raised her crystal pendant toward the sky, then lowered it to point at the baby. "Names carry power," she intoned, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "They shape destiny. They declare purpose. The name of this child came to me in vision, whispered by the universe itself. This child shall be called Hope, for she is the living embodiment of hope made manifest. But she shall also carry a second name, Faith. Not just my faith that brought her here, but faith in what humanity can become when we choose compassion over cruelty." As if responding to her name, little Hope laughed, a sound like bells, like water over smooth stones, like pure joy given audible form. And in that laugh, every person present felt something shift in their own hearts, felt their own capacity for judgment and cruelty exposed and uncomfortable. Victoria stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent. All remember her leadership in mocking Grace. All wondered what she would say in this moment of ultimate reversal. "I ask permission," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion, "to serve as this child's second mother. Not to replace Grace, but to support her. I want to pour into Hope all the love and wisdom I should have shown her mother from the beginning. I want to demonstrate through my actions that people can change, can grow, can become better than they once were." She looked up at Grace with eyes that held genuine transformation. "I want this child to know that her mother's faith didn't just move the universe, it moved human hearts. It changed me. It changed all of us. And that is perhaps the greater miracle." Grace stood, carefully balancing Hope in one arm, while reaching down to lift Victoria with the other. The two women embraced, and in that embrace was the dissolution of 7 years of cruelty, the healing of wounds that had seemed permanent, the demonstration that forgiveness is not weakness, but the most powerful force for transformation in human experience. "Hope will have many mothers," Grace declared to the assembled crowd. "Many teachers. She will grow surrounded not by women who are perfect, but by women who learn from their mistakes, who face their own capacity for cruelty and chose to become compassionate instead. That is the legacy I want for my daughter. Not protection from the reality that humans can be cruel, but demonstration that humans can also change, heal, and become better than they were." "5 years flowed past like the river of urban life. Hope grew into a child of remarkable wisdom and unusual compassion, just as Eleanor had predicted. But more significant than the fulfillment of predictions about the child was the transformation that had rippled through their entire community. The story of Grace's faith had become their social circle's foundational myth, told to children learning about perseverance, to young women facing their own struggles, to anyone who needed reminder that human judgment is limited and the universe's timeline operates according to rhythms mortals cannot comprehend. But Grace's role had evolved far beyond merely being Hope's mother. She had become the city's keeper of wisdom about faith, suffering, and transformation. Women who struggled with fertility came to her workshops, but so did those facing other challenges. Startup founders whose companies had failed, artists whose work had been rejected, people whose bodies had betrayed them with illness. Grace listened to each person with complete presence, drawing on her 7 years of suffering to create space for their pain without trying to fix or dismiss it. She had learned that the most powerful healing comes not from someone who has never suffered, but from someone who has walked through suffering and emerged transformed rather than destroyed by it. 3 years after Hope's birth, the universe provided one final teaching that completed the circle of transformation. Victoria, who had always prided herself on her perfect health and fitness, received a diagnosis that shook her to her core, a serious health condition that would require extensive treatment and uncertain prognosis. And Victoria, the proud first wife, who had once mocked Grace's struggles, now came to her former victim trembling with fear. "I'm terrified," Victoria confessed, sitting in Grace's section of the penthouse, with tears streaming down her face. "I've always been in control, always been strong. And I keep thinking, is this punishment? Am I finally paying the price for my cruelty to you? Is the universe balancing the scales?" Grace took Victoria's face in both hands and looked into her eyes with fierce intensity. "Sister, listen to me with complete attention. The universe does not operate on punishment and revenge. It operates on cause and effect, on learning and growth, on the mysterious choreography that brings us exactly the experiences we need for our spiritual development. This illness is not punishment, it is opportunity. An opportunity for you to experience vulnerability you once dismissed in others. An opportunity for all of us to demonstrate that forgiveness is not merely words, but actions." She moved her hands to hold Victoria's trembling ones. "You will survive this. You will heal. I will be there beside you, holding your hand, supporting you through every treatment. Because that is what family does. That is what community means. We do not abandon each other in difficulty. We show up. We support. We love." Through the months of Victoria's treatment, Grace remained constant. She sat through chemotherapy sessions, held Victoria's hand during procedures, brought organic meals when hospital food became unbearable. She organized the other women to create a support network, ensuring Victoria never faced a treatment alone. And through it all, Grace never once mentioned the mockery, never pointed out the irony, never claimed moral superiority. She simply loved, simply showed up, simply demonstrated that true strength manifests not through dominance, but through compassion. "You are strong enough for this," Grace would whisper during the hardest moments. "Your body knows how to heal. Trust the process. Breathe, sister. Breathe." When the doctors finally declared Victoria in full remission, the relief that flooded the consultation room was overwhelming. Victoria collapsed against Grace, alive, intact, having survived the ordeal that had forced her to confront her own mortality and vulnerability. "Thank you," Victoria whispered, her arms wrapped around Grace. "Thank you for not leaving me. Thank you for being better than I was. Thank you for teaching me that love is always stronger than revenge." Grace held her close, tears streaming down her own face. "We walked through the fire together, sister. That's what it means to be human. To suffer, to support, to transform." 2 more years passed, and the transformation that had begun with Grace's prayer at the lake had completely reshaped not just her life, but the entire social fabric of their community. The 3 wives who had once existed in hierarchy and hostility now functioned as genuine sisters, raising their children collectively, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating each other's joys. The children absorbed through daily experience what their mothers had learned through suffering, that family transcends biology, that love requires conscious choice, that community means choosing to support rather than tear down. Grace made it her practice to bring hope to the lake on the anniversary of that transformative night. She wanted her daughter to understand not just that she was conceived through faith, but what that faith had required, what it had cost, and what it had ultimately created. "This is where I stopped begging and started declaring," Grace explained to her 7-year-old daughter, who listened with unusual intensity. "This is where I learned that the universe responds not to desperation, but to certainty, not to hope, but to knowing." "But mother," Hope asked with the penetrating questions that sometimes made adults uncomfortable, "why did the universe make you wait so long? Why did it let people hurt you?" Grace smiled, that same mysterious smile that had puzzled people during the early weeks of her transformation. My daughter, I used to ask that same question with such bitterness and confusion. But now, from this side of the journey, I understand. If the universe had given me a child in the first year, I would have been grateful, yes. But I would not have been transformed. I would not have developed the unshakable faith that comes only from holding on when everything tells you to surrender. She turned to face Hope directly, placing both hands on the child's small shoulders. More importantly, if I had not walked through that valley of mockery and suffering, I could not sit now with women facing their own struggles and truly understand their pain. My 7 years of waiting were not punishment, my precious one. They were preparation. The universe was not ignoring my prayers. It was answering them in a way I could not yet perceive, teaching me lessons I needed to learn before I could be trusted with the blessing I desired. Grace's reputation as a teacher of faith and transformation had spread far beyond their social circle. People traveled from across the city to hear the woman whose unshakable conviction had moved the universe itself, whose response to cruelty had been forgiveness, whose suffering had been alchemized into wisdom rather than bitterness. When she taught, people listened with unusual intensity, because Grace did not speak from theory or philosophy. She spoke from scars that had become stars, from wounds that had become wisdom, from suffering that had been transformed into strength. The measure of your life, she would tell those gathered to learn, is not determined by what happens to you, but by what you do with what happens to you. Suffering will come. That is the nature of existence in this imperfect world. The question is whether you will allow suffering to make you bitter or better, to close your heart or expand it, to diminish you or refine you. The story of Grace had become more than personal history. It had become the city's modern parable about transformation, their primary teaching tale about the power of faith and the necessity of compassion. Parents told it to children. Teachers referenced it in schools. Young people invoked it when facing their own struggles. The impact rippled far beyond issues of fertility. The story taught that human judgment is limited and often wrong, that the universe's timing operates according to rhythms mortals cannot perceive, that responding to cruelty with compassion breaks cycles of harm that can persist for generations, that faith is not about believing despite doubt, but about knowing with such certainty that doubt cannot form. A decade and a half passed. Grace aged into midlife with grace and authority earned through lived experience, rather than merely accumulated years. Her face showed the marks of time and motherhood, but her spirit had only grown stronger, more luminous, more capable of holding space for others, suffering while simultaneously calling them toward transformation. Hope had grown into a young woman of remarkable wisdom, pursuing social work and psychology, carrying forward her mother's mission of helping others transform suffering into strength. But beyond this biological legacy, Grace had created something even more enduring, a network of spiritual daughters, women she had mentored through their own dark nights, who now carried her teaching forward, multiplying the impact of that single declaration made at the lake years ago. On the 15th anniversary of that night, when everything changed, hundreds gathered at the lake for a ceremony honoring not just Grace's personal journey, but the collective transformation her faith had catalyzed. The spot where she had stood making her declaration had become an unofficial sacred site, a place where people came to make their own prayers, to declare their own certainty, to connect with the power that responds to authentic faith. As the sun set and the moon rose, once again full, once again enormous, Grace stood at the water's edge with her daughter beside her, surrounded by the community that had been transformed through witnessing her journey. Eleanor, now quite elderly but still the city's most respected spiritual advisor, raised her staff and spoke to the assembled people. 15 years ago, a woman came to this lake in her darkest hour. She had been mocked, scorned, labeled as inadequate and broken. She had every reason to surrender to despair, to accept the identity that others attempted to force upon her, to believe that the universe had abandoned her to permanent suffering. The old psychic paused, her eyes finding Grace in the crowd. But instead, she did something that changed not just her life, but all of our lives. She refused to accept human judgment as final verdict. She refused to let mockery define her worth. She refused to beg when begging had brought no results. Instead, she declared. She spoke from certainty rather than hope. She claimed what was already hers in the spiritual realm and trusted that physical reality would eventually align. She struck her staff against the ground, and the sound rang out across the water. But the greater miracle, Eleanor continued, was not that the universe answered her prayer. The greater miracle was what she did with that answer. She could have gloated. She could have turned a mockery back on those who hurt her. She could have demanded their humiliation as payment for her suffering. Her voice grew stronger, powered by the passion of someone bearing witness to genuine transformation. Instead, she chose compassion. She chose forgiveness. She chose to transform her suffering into wisdom rather than bitterness. And in doing so, she taught all of us that the measure of a person is not what they have been given, but what they do with what they have been given, whether blessing or burden. Grace stepped forward, and in the sudden silence that fell, she could hear the lake lapping gently at the shore, the distant hum of traffic, the eternal rhythm of the city that had witnessed her entire transformation. "I stand here," she began, her voice clear and strong, "not to celebrate my own righteousness or to shame those who once hurt me. I stand here to testify to a truth that everyone needs to understand. The universe is always listening. Always. But it responds not to begging from desperation, but to declaration from certainty." She paused, letting her words settle into the hearts of those listening. "My 7 years of waiting were not wasted. They were necessary. They taught me patience that prosperity never cultivates. They developed faith that easy blessing never forges. They gave me empathy that comfort never creates. They prepared me to be not just a mother to one child, but a spiritual mother to many." The lesson I want you to carry from this story is not that faith guarantees you will get what you want when you want it. The lesson is that faith allows you to hold on during the waiting, to maintain your dignity during the mockery, to choose compassion despite cruelty, to trust that the universe's timing is wiser than your impatience. Her voice grew softer, but somehow more powerful. And perhaps most importantly, when your prayers are answered, and they will be answered, though perhaps not in the timing or manner you expect, remember that every blessing carries responsibility. Use your blessing to bless others. Transform your pain into wisdom that heals. Become living proof that suffering can refine rather than destroy, that mockery can strengthen rather than diminish, that faith can indeed move the universe itself. As Grace concluded her testimony, the lake responded exactly as it had 15 years before. The water caught moonlight and transformed it into something more than mere reflection. It became luminescence, radiance, visible confirmation that the spiritual realm was present and listening. The mist rose from the water's surface in those same spiral patterns, ancient symbol of consciousness, of galaxies, of the fundamental structure underlying all existence. And every person present felt something shift in their own hearts, felt their own capacity for faith expand, felt themselves connected not just to each other, but to something vast and mysterious and ultimately loving. The celebration that followed was unlike any the park had witnessed. Music filled the air, not just from speakers, but from voices raised in songs of gratitude and hope. Bodies moved in spontaneous dance. Strangers embraced. Children ran freely, absorbing the atmosphere of collective joy. But beneath the celebration was understanding. This was not merely commemorating past events. This was collective commitment to carry the teaching forward, to remember that faith moves the universe, that compassion heals communities, that suffering can be transformed into strength, that human judgment is limited and often wrong, that divine timing operates according to rhythms mortals cannot fully comprehend. As the celebration concluded and people made their way home through the city streets, Grace and Hope walked together, mother and daughter, their hands linked, their steps synchronized through years of walking side by side. "Mother," Hope said softly, breaking the companionable silence, "if you could go back to that night 15 years ago, knowing everything you know now, would you still make the same declaration? Would you still choose that path, even knowing the suffering it required?" Grace was quiet for several steps, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Finally, Grace stopped and turned to face her daughter, placing both hands on Hope's shoulders. "My precious one, I would not change a single moment. Not the mockery that broke my heart, Not the years of waiting that tested my faith. Not the humiliation that drove me to the lake. Because all of it, every moment of suffering, every tear shed in darkness, every experience of being diminished and scorned, all of it was preparation for becoming the woman I am today. She pulled Hope close, embracing her daughter. You are not just the answer to my prayer, my daughter. You are the proof that faith spoken with certainty moves the universe itself. But more than that, you are the continuation of a teaching that will outlive both of us. You carry within you the understanding that suffering can be transformed, that mockery can be met with compassion, that human judgment is limited, and that the universe always, always responds to authentic faith. And so the story of Grace, the woman whose faith moved the universe, whose suffering was transformed into wisdom, whose mockery was met with compassion, whose declaration at the city lake changed an entire community's understanding of faith, forgiveness, and divine timing. This story became the city's most treasured modern parable, passed from generation to generation, shared on social media and in conversation, adapted and retold in countless variations, but always carrying the same essential truth. The universe is always listening. Always. But it responds not to desperation, but to declaration. Not to hoping, but to knowing. Not to begging from a place of lack, but to claiming from a place of certainty what already exists in the spiritual realm, waiting only for time to translate it into physical manifestation. And what happened to Grace? She continued teaching until well into her later years, becoming one of the city's most sought-after speakers and spiritual guides. When she finally passed peacefully at the age of 78, surrounded by her daughter, grandchildren, and the countless lives she had touched, the entire city mourned the loss of someone who had fundamentally changed how they understood faith, suffering, and transformation. But her teaching continued. Hope carried it forward, becoming a renowned therapist and author. Hope's students after her spread the wisdom further, and their students after them, creating a lineage of transformation that ripples outward even now, touching lives in ways that cannot be measured or quantified. Because the truth Grace discovered, that faith spoken with certainty moves the universe itself, that suffering can be transformed into wisdom, that mockery can be met with compassion, that divine timing is wiser than human impatience. This truth is not confined to one city, one time, one culture. It is universal, eternal, available to anyone who finds themselves in the darkness before dawn, in the suffering that precedes transformation, in the mockery that tests their faith, in the waiting that develops patience. So if you find yourself in Grace's position, if you face mockery, if you endure suffering that seems endless, if you struggle with circumstances that break your heart and test your faith, remember her testimony. Stop begging. Start declaring. Stop hoping. Start knowing. Stop accepting human judgment as final verdict. Start claiming what is already yours in the spiritual realm. And when the universe answers, and it will answer, though perhaps not in your timing or your expected manner, use your blessing to bless others. Transform your suffering into wisdom that heals. Become living proof that faith indeed moves the universe itself. This is the testimony of Grace, the woman who refused to remain barren in spirit even when her body seemed barren in flesh. The woman who discovered that the universe responds not to desperation, but to declaration. The woman whose story continues to echo through the city and beyond, teaching anyone with ears to hear that faith, compassion, and unshakable conviction can indeed transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. May her story strengthen your own faith. May it teach you that suffering is preparation, not punishment. May it remind you that you are stronger than any mockery, more powerful than any circumstance, more connected to divine intelligence than you have perhaps realized. And may you, like Grace, discover that when you speak from certainty rather than hope, from knowing rather than wishing, from declaration rather than desperation, the universe has no choice but to respond. And so we conclude the Chronicle of Grace, whose declaration at the city lake moved not just her own circumstances, but the consciousness of everyone who witnessed her journey. This story has been shared countless times since that transformative night, will continue to be shared for generations to come, because it carries truth that transcends time and culture. Remember, You are not defined by what happens to you. You are defined by what you do with what happens to you. Choose faith over despair. Choose compassion over revenge. Choose declaration over desperation. The universe is listening. Right now. To you. What will you declare?